Get out. Now. The words didn't echo, they landed flat, cold, final, like a door already closing before anyone touched the handle. Ava Johnson froze for half a second, her fingers still resting on the edge of the polished conference table, the faint smell of lemon cleaner clinging to her skin, her reflection barely visible in the glass surface beneath the overhead lights. Around her, the room stretched wide and sterile, a $40 million view of downtown Chicago framed in floor-to-ceiling windows, sunlight slicing across the marble floor in sharp, unforgiving lines. No one moved. Not the men in tailored suits, not the assistants tapping quietly on tablets, not even the junior analyst who had been mid-sentence before the interruption. Everything paused, just long enough to make her presence feel louder than it should have. Ava lowered her hand slowly, careful, deliberate, as if even the smallest sudden motion might justify what had just been said. She didn't argue. She didn't look surprised. She simply nodded once, eyes down, shoulders squared in a way that didn't quite match the uniform she wore, a plain navy cleaning shirt, sleeves rolled just past her wrists, a badge clipped slightly crooked near her collar. She turned toward the door, her shoes making almost no sound against the marble, trained over years to move through spaces like this without being noticed, without leaving a trace. But halfway there, her gaze flickered, just for a second, toward the stack of documents sitting open at the center of the table. White pages. Black ink. One page slightly misaligned. It wasn't curiosity that made her pause. It was recognition. Something subtle. Something wrong. Behind her, Richard Coleman stood at the head of the table, one hand resting lightly against the leather chair, the other holding a pen that hadn't touched paper yet. His expression didn't change, but his presence filled the room like pressure, controlled, measured, absolute. He didn't raise his voice again. He didn't need to. Ava took another step toward the door, fingers brushing the cool metal of the handle, the hallway beyond dimmer, quieter, safer in its invisibility. This was how it always worked. You saw something. You said nothing. You kept your job. You stayed invisible. Her grip tightened just slightly, then loosened again. A breath in. Slow. Careful. The kind of breath that steadies more than just lungs. She glanced back, not at him, not at anyone, but at the document again, that one line buried halfway down the page, dressed in legal language but leaning just enough to tilt everything that came after it. Her heart tapped once, sharp and certain. Then she let go of the door. Not fully. Just enough to turn halfway back into the room, her voice quiet, almost too soft to belong in a place like this. Sir, you might want to check page 12. For a moment, nothing responded. No laughter. No immediate dismissal. Just a silence that shifted, not frozen this time, but watching, waiting, recalculating. And in that thin, fragile space between being ignored and being seen, Ava Johnson stood still, no longer invisible, but not yet understood. No one laughed, but the silence that followed was not kindness, it was evaluation, the kind that measured worth in seconds and dismissed it just as quickly, and Ava felt it settle across the room like a thin layer of dust, invisible but undeniable, as every pair of eyes that mattered stayed fixed not on her face but on the interruption itself, as if the idea of her speaking carried more weight than whatever she had said, and for a brief moment she considered taking it back, letting the words dissolve into the air the way she had learned to let so many things go, but she did not move, her posture steady, her hands relaxed at her sides, the faint hum of the air conditioning brushing against her skin while the city beyond the glass windows continued without pause, cars inching along streets 30 floors below, people walking with purpose, unaware that inside this room, something small had just shifted. Richard Coleman did not look at her immediately, his attention still anchored to the document in front of him, the pen between his fingers turning once, slowly, a habit that signaled thought rather than dismissal, and that alone changed the temperature of the room, subtle but real, because men like him did not pause for interruptions. Unless something about them refused to be ignored, and Ava noticed it, not with relief, but with recognition, the same quiet awareness that had guided her through years of watching from the edges, learning without being taught, absorbing without being invited. She had not always worn a uniform like this, not always moved through buildings with a cart and a schedule dictated by other people's priorities. There had been a time when her hands held different things: textbooks with highlighted margins, printed case studies filled with annotations, long nights spent under dim apartment lighting where the air smelled of instant coffee and determination, her mother asleep in the next room, medical bills stacked neatly on the kitchen counter like a second clock counting down, and even now, standing in a space that was never meant for her voice, those memories did not feel distant, they felt paused, waiting, like a conversation that had never properly ended. Someone near the far end of the table shifted in their chair, a quiet movement that broke the stillness just enough to remind everyone that the meeting had not officially stopped, that there were numbers to discuss, signatures to consider, decisions worth millions of dollars resting on clean lines of ink, and yet none of that resumed, not yet, because the smallest fracture had appeared in the rhythm, and once something like that happens, it demands attention whether anyone admits it or not. Ava lowered her gaze again, not out of submission, but control, choosing stillness over urgency, because she understood something most of them did not, that truth does not need volume, it only needs precision, and if she had seen what she believed she had seen, then the page would speak for itself, regardless of who delivered the warning. Her breath remained even, her shoulders relaxed, but inside, beneath the calm surface she had practiced for years, there was a quiet tension, not fear, not regret, but the awareness of consequence, the understanding that stepping even half an inch outside of the role assigned to her could cost everything she had managed to hold together, the job that paid for prescriptions, the routine that kept her life stable, the fragile balance she had built one shift at a time, and still, she had spoken, not because she wanted to be heard, but because ignoring it would have meant something worse, something she would have carried long after this room forgot her name. Richard's pen stopped turning, the motion halting mid-rotation as his eyes finally dropped to the page she had mentioned, and though his expression remained composed, there was a subtle tightening along his jaw, almost imperceptible unless someone knew to look for it, and Ava did not lift her head, but she felt it, the shift, the moment when dismissal gives way to attention, when certainty begins to question itself. And in that narrow space between what was assumed and what might be true, the room held its breath again, only this time, it was not because she had spoken, it was because someone powerful had started to listen. The room did not return to normal, not yet, because something in the air had shifted too far to pretend otherwise, and even the quiet clicking of keyboards had stopped entirely, replaced by a stillness that felt heavier now, more deliberate, as if every person present understood that whatever happened next would not be part of the agenda they had prepared for, and at the center of it all, Richard Coleman remained standing, his eyes fixed on the document, scanning once, then again, slower this time, his fingers no longer moving, the pen now resting against the paper without purpose. Ava did not move from where she stood near the door, her hand no longer touching the handle, her posture unchanged, but her awareness sharpened, not hopeful, not expectant, simply attentive, the same way she had been in lecture halls years ago, listening for what others missed, catching the subtle inconsistencies buried beneath polished language, the kind that only revealed themselves if someone took the time to truly read instead of assume. A man seated 2 chairs down from Richard leaned forward slightly, trying to glance at the page, his voice low but edged with impatience as he spoke, asking if there was an issue, but Richard did not respond immediately, and that silence, coming from him, carried more weight than any answer could have, because men like him were not known for hesitation, not in rooms like this, not with stakes like these, and yet there it was, unmistakable. Ava's eyes lowered again, not out of avoidance, but discipline, because she knew that this moment did not belong to her, it belonged to the truth she had pointed to, and anything more would risk turning attention back into dismissal, something she had learned to navigate carefully, step by step, year after year. The sunlight had shifted slightly, the angle now cutting across the table in a sharper line, illuminating the exact section of the document Richard was reading, as if the room itself had decided to underline what mattered, and in that light, the flaw became harder to ignore, the wording precise but dangerous, a clause that appeared protective on the surface but quietly transferred liability in a way that would leave his company exposed if anything went wrong after the agreement was signed. One of the executives cleared his throat, adjusting his tie, attempting to re-establish control of the meeting, but the effort felt hollow, because attention had already moved, redirected by something no one had expected to come from a voice like hers, and Ava felt that shift without looking up, the way tension redistributes in a space, subtle but unmistakable. Richard finally exhaled, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to signal that something had been confirmed, his jaw tightening once more as he flipped the page back, then forward again, verifying what he had seen, and for a brief moment, something crossed his expression, not confusion, not anger, but recognition, the kind that comes when certainty is interrupted by fact. He lifted his gaze, not toward the executives seated around the table, not toward the legal team who should have caught it, but toward the door, toward her, and though Ava did not meet his eyes immediately, she felt it, that direct line of attention, heavier than anything that had come before, because it was no longer about interruption, it was about accountability. No one spoke. No one moved. The city outside continued its steady rhythm, cars passing, lights shifting. Life unfolding as if nothing had changed, but inside that room, something quiet but irreversible, and Ava Johnson, still standing in her Navy uniform, still holding nothing in her hands, had become the center of it without ever stepping forward, without raising her voice, without asking to be seen, and for the first time since she had entered that space, the silence around her did not feel like erasure, it felt like weight. The silence did not break all at once, it shifted, slowly, like a room adjusting to a truth no one had prepared for, and Richard Coleman straightened just slightly, his hand finally lifting the pen from the page as if it no longer belonged there, as if signing anything in that moment would have been a mistake too obvious to ignore. He did not raise his voice when he spoke, but every word carried across the table with precision. "Who reviewed this clause?" The question landed without urgency, but no one answered immediately, not because they did not hear it, but because they understood what it meant, the kind of question that does not ask for information, it asks for accountability. A few glances shifted between the legal team, subtle, quick, the kind people exchange when responsibility becomes something to avoid rather than claim, and one of the senior associates cleared his throat, adjusting the cuff of his suit as he leaned forward, offering a measured response about standard review procedures, about how the document had passed through multiple hands, about how nothing unusual had been flagged. Richard listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, but his eyes returned to the page before the explanation finished, as if the answer did not matter as much as the fact that it had not been caught. Ava remained near the door, still and composed, but her presence no longer blended into the background, it lingered, undeniable now, like a note that continued to resonate even after the sound had technically ended. She did not step forward, did not attempt to explain further, because she understood something the room was only beginning to realize, that the more she said, the easier it would be to shift the focus away from the document itself, and this moment was not about her voice, it was about what had been written in plain sight. The sunlight had moved again, stretching farther across the table, catching the edge of the paper in a sharp reflection that made the ink appear darker, more defined, and Richard tapped the page once with the pen, not aggressively, just enough to anchor the attention of everyone present. "This shifts full liability," he said, his tone even, controlled, but unmistakably firm. "If this goes through as written, we carry the entire risk." The word settled heavily, and this time, there was no attempt to move past them, no quiet typing, no polite nods, only the weight of realization spreading across the table as people recalculated, reassessed, reconsidered what had almost been approved without question. One of the executives leaned back slightly, his chair making a soft sound against the marble floor, while another reached for the document, flipping to the page with a sharper motion, eyes scanning quickly, more carefully now, as if seeing it for the first time. Ava lowered her gaze again, not because she needed to, but because she knew this was the turning point, the exact moment when what had been dismissed became undeniable, and there was a quiet steadiness in her breathing, a controlled calm that came not from confidence, but from clarity, the kind that does not waver once it is recognized. Richard finally looked up again, and this time, his attention did not drift across the room, it returned directly to her, and though his expression remained composed, there was something different in it now, something less certain, more deliberate, as if he was reassessing not just the document, but the person who had pointed to it. "You," he said, not sharply, not dismissively, but with a focus that cut through the remaining distance between them. The room stilled again, but differently this time, not frozen by interruption, but held in place by expectation, and Ava lifted her eyes just enough to meet his gaze, not challenging, not hesitant, simply present. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and in that quiet exchange, something shifted again, something that had nothing to do with titles or roles, but everything to do with recognition, and though no one else in the room could fully name it yet, they felt it, the subtle but undeniable change in balance, the moment when being overlooked no longer applied, and the space between them was no longer defined by hierarchy alone. The word hung in the air longer than it should have, simple, direct, but heavy with intent, and Ava felt every eye in the room shift toward her again, not with dismissal this time, but with expectation, the kind that demanded an answer whether she wanted to give one or not. She did not move immediately, her body still angled toward the door, the hallway behind her quiet and distant now, as if it belonged to a different moment, one she had already stepped out of without realizing it. Her fingers rested lightly against her side, steady, controlled, but inside, there was a tightening, not fear, not exactly, but the awareness that whatever came next would define more than just this conversation, it would define how she was seen, if she was seen at all. Richard did not repeat himself, but his gaze did not leave her, and that alone carried more pressure than any raised voice could have. Around the table, a few of the executives shifted in their seats, subtle movements that betrayed discomfort, because this was not how meetings like this were supposed to go, not how roles were supposed to blur, not how authority was supposed to be questioned, even indirectly. Ava took a slow breath, the kind that fills the chest and settles the mind at the same time, and then she turned fully back into the room, not rushing, not hesitating, each step measured, deliberate, her shoes making the faintest sound against the marble floor as she moved just far enough from the door to be seen clearly, but not so far as to claim space that was not offered. "It looks standard," she said quietly, her voice even, controlled, carrying just enough to reach him without forcing anyone else to lean in. "But the wording on page 12 shifts post-agreement liability entirely to your side if anything triggers a dispute clause." She did not look around the table as she spoke, did not seek validation or reaction, her eyes staying level, focused, because she understood that credibility did not come from volume, it came from clarity, and anything beyond that would only give them a reason to question her instead of the document. A man near the center of the table let out a short breath, almost a scoff, not loud, but enough to register, his head tilting slightly as if weighing whether to challenge her, but he said nothing, not yet, because the evidence sat in front of them, undeniable now, and even skepticism needed something to stand on. Richard's expression remained composed, but his attention sharpened, his posture shifting just slightly forward, not aggressive, not confrontational, but engaged in a way that had not been there before. "And you saw this how?" he asked, the question precise, not dismissive, but not accepting either, a test more than a challenge. Ava held his gaze for a moment, just long enough to acknowledge the question without shrinking from it, and then she answered, her tone unchanged. "I read it." The simplicity of it settled into the room, unexpected in its directness, and for a brief moment, no one responded, because there was nothing to argue against in that statement, no angle to deflect, no assumption to hide behind. One of the legal advisors shifted again, leaning forward now, eyes narrowing slightly as he scanned the document with renewed focus, tracing the exact section she had referenced, and this time, his reaction was not neutral, his lips pressing together as realization caught up with him. Ava felt it ripple outward, subtle but real, the moment when doubt gives way to confirmation, when what seemed unlikely becomes undeniable, and still, she did not move, did not speak again, because the room no longer needed her to explain, it needed to confront what had been missed. Richard exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping the edge of the paper once, thoughtful, controlled, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a different weight, less about authority, more about recalculation. "You were about to walk out," he said, not as an accusation, not even as a question, but as an observation, one that shifted the focus slightly, drawing a line between what had almost happened and what now stood in front of him. Ava gave a small nod, her expression unchanged. "Yes, sir." The answer was simple, but it carried something underneath it, something quiet and firm, the kind of truth that does not need to be explained further, and for the first time since she had entered the room, the distance between them felt smaller, not physically, but in understanding, as if something that had been invisible moments ago was now impossible to ignore, and no one in the room could quite look away from it. The room did not rush to fill the silence that followed, it settled into it, slower now, heavier, as if everyone present understood that something important had already been said and anything added too quickly might disrupt it, and Ava felt that shift not as pressure, but as space, a rare kind of quiet that did not erase her, but allowed her to exist within it without being pushed back into the margins. The sunlight had softened slightly, no longer cutting sharply across the table but diffusing into a warmer glow that reflected off the glass walls and polished surfaces, casting faint shadows that moved almost imperceptibly with the passing minutes, and in that stillness, the tension that had once been sharp began to stretch, less immediate, more reflective. Richard remained at the head of the table, his posture no longer rigid, but not relaxed either, his attention anchored somewhere between the document in front of him and the woman standing several feet away, as if he was recalibrating not just the situation, but his understanding of it. No one interrupted. No one tried to reclaim control of the meeting. Even the subtle sounds that usually filled spaces like this, the quiet tapping, the shifting of papers, the low murmurs of side conversations, had disappeared entirely, replaced by something quieter, something more intentional. Ava stood with her weight evenly balanced, her shoulders steady, her breathing calm, but beneath that calm there was movement, a quiet current of thought, memory, and restraint, because she knew moments like this did not come often, and when they did, they were fragile, easily redirected, easily dismissed if handled carelessly. She did not step forward again. She did not add more explanation. She allowed the silence to hold what had already been said, because she understood that sometimes the strongest position was not to push, but to remain, to let the truth settle into the space without forcing it to be accepted. Across the table, one of the legal advisors closed the folder slowly, the soft sound of paper against paper marking a subtle shift in the rhythm of the room, not an ending, but a pause, and another executive leaned back, exhaling quietly, as if releasing something he had not realized he was holding. The city beyond the windows continued its steady movement, cars gliding through intersections, sunlight reflecting off distant buildings, life carrying on without interruption, and yet inside that room, time felt different, slower, more deliberate, each second stretching just enough to allow thought to catch up with reality. Richard's gaze lifted again, not sharply, not with authority, but with intention, and when it settled on Ava this time, there was something in it that had not been there before, not doubt, not dismissal, but consideration, the kind that comes when assumptions begin to loosen their hold. He did not speak immediately, and that restraint carried weight, because it suggested that whatever came next would not be reaction, it would be decision. Ava met his gaze briefly, then let her eyes soften, not in retreat, but in quiet confidence, the kind that does not demand recognition, but does not avoid it either. In that moment, there was no need for titles, no need for roles to be defined out loud, because something else had already taken their place, something quieter but more real, the acknowledgement that value does not always arrive in expected forms, and when it does not, it has a way of revealing more than just what was overlooked. The air in the room felt different now, less rigid, more open, as if the space itself had expanded just slightly, allowing something new to exist within it, and Ava stood there, not as someone who had stepped out of line, but as someone who had stepped into a moment that could not be undone, and for the first time since she had reached for the door, leaving no longer felt like the only direction forward. Richard did not look back at the document this time, not immediately, because whatever he needed to confirm had already been confirmed, and instead his attention remained on Ava, steady, focused, as if he was trying to reconcile two versions of reality that no longer aligned, the one he had assumed when he first spoke, and the one now standing quietly in front of him without asking for anything in return. The distance between them felt smaller, not in space, but in understanding, and that shift carried a weight that no one in the room could ignore, even if they did not fully understand it yet. He set the pen down slowly, not as a gesture, not as a signal, but as a decision, the kind that separates habit from intention, and the faint sound of it touching the table seemed louder than it should have been in the quiet room. "You said you read it," he began, his voice even, controlled, but no longer distant, and there was a subtle difference in the way he spoke now, not addressing her as a disruption, but as a source. Ava nodded once, her expression calm, her posture unchanged, but inside, she felt the shift solidify, the moment where doubt turned into acknowledgement, not fully spoken yet, but undeniable in tone. "Yes, sir." Richard held her gaze for a second longer, then glanced briefly at the document again, as if confirming that what had happened was real, that the oversight had not been imagined, that the correction had come from exactly where it had appeared to come from. Around the table, the others remained silent, watching, waiting, their earlier confidence replaced by something quieter, more cautious, as if they were all recalibrating at the same time. One of the senior executives leaned forward again, his voice softer now, more measured, asking if the clause could be revised before proceeding, and another nodded quickly, already flipping through pages with a renewed sense of urgency. But Richard raised a hand slightly, not sharply, just enough to pause them, because this moment was no longer about the document alone, it was about something else that had emerged alongside it. He looked back at Ava, and for a brief second, the authority in his posture gave way to something more human, something less practiced, as if he was stepping outside of a role he had held for too long without question. "That is not something most people catch on a first read," he said, "not as praise, not yet, but as fact," and the words carried a quiet weight because they acknowledged something that could no longer be dismissed. Ava did not respond immediately, not out of hesitation, but because she understood that recognition, when it comes, does not need to be rushed, and she simply inclined her head slightly, accepting the statement without adding to it. The room remained still, but the energy had changed completely now, no longer tense, no longer resistant, but attentive, open in a way that had not existed before, and even the light in the room seemed softer, less harsh, reflecting off surfaces without cutting across them. Richard took a small step away from the table, not toward her, not yet, but enough to shift his position from behind authority to beside the situation itself, and that movement, subtle as it was, carried meaning, because it suggested that he was no longer standing above the moment, but within it. "Where did you learn to read contracts like that?" he asked, and this time, the question was not a test, not a challenge, it was genuine, direct, and it landed differently, because it opened a door instead of closing one. Ava felt it, the change in direction, the invitation that had not been there before, and for a brief moment, memories surfaced again, classrooms, notes, late nights, the life she had paused rather than left, and she took a slow breath before answering, her voice steady, grounded, carrying just enough to reach him without needing to reach anyone else. "I studied business law for 2 years, she said, simple, clear, unembellished, and the words settled into the room with a quiet finality, not dramatic, not exaggerated, but enough to redraw everything that had been assumed about her in the span of a single sentence. No one spoke. No one moved. Because in that moment, the truth did not just correct a document, it corrected a perception, and the weight of that realization was something none of them could ignore anymore. The words did not fade after she said them, they settled, steady and undeniable, and the room seemed to absorb them in silence, as if everyone present needed a moment to adjust not just to what had been revealed, but to what it meant about everything they had assumed before. Richard did not respond immediately, and that pause carried more weight than any quick reaction could have, because it was not hesitation, it was recalculation, the kind that comes when a fixed perspective begins to shift in real time. His gaze remained on Ava, but it was no longer searching for inconsistency or challenge, it was measuring something else now, something quieter but far more important, and for the first time since she had spoken, there was no barrier in his expression, no distance created by title or position, only a focused awareness that acknowledged her presence without reducing it. Around the table, subtle movements began again, but they were different now, less rigid, more thoughtful, as if the structure of the room had loosened just enough to allow something real to move through it. One of the executives adjusted his papers, another leaned back slightly, exhaling in a controlled breath, and the legal advisor who had been silent for most of the exchange now closed the folder in front of him with a quiet finality, not defensive, not dismissive, but reflective, as if he understood that what had been missed could not be undone, only addressed. Ava remained where she stood, her posture steady, her hands relaxed, not claiming attention, but no longer avoiding it either, and there was a quiet strength in that stillness, the kind that does not demand recognition but holds its ground when recognition arrives. Richard took a small step forward this time, not abrupt, not commanding, but intentional, the distance between them narrowing by just enough to shift the dynamic again, and when he spoke, his voice carried a different tone, not authority alone, but acknowledgement layered beneath it. "Why did you stop?" he asked, the question simple on the surface, but carrying something deeper, something that reached beyond the document, beyond the moment, into the space where her past and present met. Ava felt it, the weight behind the words, and for a brief moment, the polished room around her faded into something quieter, something more personal, the memory of nights spent studying, of plans carefully built and slowly set aside, of choices made not out of failure, but necessity. She did not rush to answer, allowing the question to settle fully before responding, her voice calm, grounded, carrying no bitterness, only truth. "My mother got sick," she said softly. I needed to work. The simplicity of it filled the room in a way no elaborate explanation could have, because it required no interpretation, no justification, only understanding, and that understanding moved through the space slowly, shifting expressions, lowering defenses, softening edges that had been rigid only minutes before. Richard did not look away this time, and something in his posture changed again, almost imperceptibly, but enough to signal that what he was hearing mattered, not as information, but as context, as reality that could not be dismissed or reduced. He nodded once, a small motion, controlled, but genuine, and the acknowledgement in it carried more meaning than a longer response ever could have. You were leaving, he said again, quieter now, not as a statement of fact, but as something closer to reflection, and Ava gave a slight nod in return, her expression unchanged, but her presence steady, rooted, no longer at the edge of the room, but within it. The air felt different now, not tense, not uncertain, but open in a way that had not existed before, and though no one said it out loud, everyone in that room understood that the moment had moved beyond a simple correction, beyond a single clause in a contract, into something larger, something that could not be ignored or easily forgotten, because it had revealed not just an error on a page, but a truth about the people standing around it, and the quiet woman who had almost walked away without being seen. No one rushed to speak after that, because there was nothing left that needed to be explained in words. The truth had already settled into the room, quiet and complete, and anything added now would only disturb what had finally become clear. Richard stood there for a moment longer, his posture no longer defined by distance or control, but by something more grounded, more human, and when he moved, it was not with authority, but with intention, a small step forward that closed the last bit of space between where he stood and where Ava remained, still steady, still composed, still exactly where she had been when she chose not to leave. The light from the windows had shifted again, softer now, stretching across the floor in long, warm lines that reflected off the marble and glass, creating a quiet glow that replaced the earlier sharpness, and in that light, the room no longer felt cold, it felt still, present, as if it had finally settled into the moment instead of resisting it. Richard reached for the document once more, but this time, he did not open it, he simply placed it flat against the table, his hand resting on top of it for a brief second before pulling away, a subtle gesture that marked the end of something unspoken, the end of assumption, the end of dismissal. We will revise it, he said, his voice calm, measured, but carrying a clarity that left no room for argument, and no one at the table questioned it, no one tried to redirect or minimize, because they all understood that the decision had already been made the moment the truth was recognized. Ava watched quietly, her expression unchanged, not expectant, not seeking anything more, because for her, the moment had already fulfilled its purpose, she had seen something, she had said something, and that had been enough. Richard turned back to her, and this time, there was no hesitation in his gaze, no distance left to maintain, only acknowledgement, clear and direct, and though his words were simple, they carried weight. Thank you. The room remained silent, but the meaning of it extended beyond the words themselves, because it was not just gratitude for a correction, it was recognition of her presence, her judgment, her value, and Ava received it with the same quiet steadiness she had held from the beginning, a small nod, nothing more, because she did not need to expand the moment to understand it. For a second, it seemed as though everything had reached its natural conclusion, the meeting ready to resume, the roles ready to settle back into place, but something had changed too deeply for things to return exactly as they were. Richard glanced briefly toward the door she had nearly walked through, then back at her, and there was a pause, brief but deliberate, before he spoke again. If you are willing, he said, the tone careful, not commanding, not assuming, stay for a few minutes. It was not an order, it was an invitation, and that difference carried more weight than anything else that had happened in the room. Ava did not respond immediately, her eyes shifting for a brief moment toward the hallway beyond the glass, the place she had been about to disappear into, the place where she had learned to remain unseen, and then back to him, to the room, to the moment that had changed without warning. She took a slow breath, steady, grounded, and gave a small nod. The air seemed to settle again, not with tension, but with quiet acceptance, and as she stepped slightly farther into the room, not fully, not completely crossing into a new role, but no longer standing at the edge of the old one, the shift became complete, not dramatic, not announced, but real.